Welcome back. We're talking about chemistry. We're on part 2 of the chemistry chapter, and what we are discussing now is chemical bonds. We will discuss 3 types of chemical bonds. This slide introduces the concept of covalent bonds. A covalent bond is when 2 atoms share at least one pair of electrons. What you can see on top here is an example of a single covalent bond between 2 hydrogen atoms. If you recall, hydrogen is a single proton and a single electron making up the element. This outer electron shell wants 2 electrons in order to be full. If hydrogen atoms bond together, they can share their electrons so that they each have a pair that can be orbiting around. So that outer valence orbital, which in this case is the first one with only room for 2, is full. This is a hydrogen molecule, hydrogen gas, that's bonded together with a single covalent bond. On the bottom, you can see 2 oxygen atoms. If you look at the outer orbital, the valence orbital on oxygen, you'll notice that there's 6 electrons in each oxygen atom. That second orbital has room for 8, so they each need 2 more. Each atom needs 2 more electrons to fill the outer shell. When 2 oxygen atoms come together to form a covalent bond, they actually will share 2 pairs. So that means that this is a double covalent bond. By doing that, the outer orbital is now full because there are a total of 8 electrons orbiting out in that outer shell for oxygen gas. If you look at this line diagram of how to depict the covalent bond, you'll notice that a single line drawn between the symbol that's for that element, in this case an H for hydrogen or an O for oxygen, the single line is indicating a single covalent bond, or one pair of electrons being shared, like there. The double line, as shown down here between these 2 oxygens, is indicating that there's actually a double covalent bond between this molecule. As an aside, we'll mention here that throughout the semester, something that is much more important when you take chemistry is that concept of electronegativity. That's the measurement of the attraction of a particular atom for the electrons. The more electronegative, the greater the pull the nucleus will exert on its electrons. That's going to come into play when we talk about polar covalent bonds in just a moment. For now, let's look at a few more examples of covalent bonds. You can see here that hydrogen can bond for carbon, but let's look closely at that outer orbital. Now you can see that this hydrogen has their 1 electron orbiting around the nucleus. That first electron shell has room for 2. Carbon has 2 orbitals, but their second one is only filled with 4 electrons, so there's room for 4 more. Now you have to keep in mind that these elements want to be happy. They're happy when that outer valence shell is completely filled with electrons. To fill them, they're going to bond with other atoms. The atoms will bond in a way that they can fill the outer electron shell. If you're going to combine carbons and hydrogens together, you have to keep in mind that hydrogen only has room for 1 more electron, so it wants to have a single covalent bond with some other element. Carbon has room for 4 more electrons, so it needs to form bonds in such a way that it can share 4 pairs of electrons in some configuration. If we look here, the carbon can combine with 4 individual hydrogens to give us this particular molecule, which is methane. It's drawn here with lines. A central carbon and 4 hydrogens jutting out. This is important to keep in mind. So remember that carbon needs 4 covalent bonds. Next, we combine carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. If we look carefully at those outer electron shells, we can again realize that carbon still needs its 4, hydrogen needs its 1, and as we mentioned a moment ago, oxygen has 6 electrons in the outer shell, so it has room for 2. If we're going to combine these elements together in a molecule, we need to do it in a way that we can satisfy each element's need to have that full outer electron shell. So we can do it in this manner. This molecule is formaldehyde. Carbon needing 4 pairs to be shared combined with 2 hydrogens taking care of a need for 2 of the pairs. Then if it combines with oxygen, oxygen needs 2 pairs. Since we still have room for 2 more bonding pairs with carbon, we can do a double bond between the carbon and the oxygen. Depicted down here with this line diagram, you can see the 2 hydrogens bonded to the carbon and a double covalent bond to the oxygen. We have to just keep in mind that we have to fulfill the need of each one of these elements' requirements to fill that outermost shell in order for that molecule to be stable. Well, you're probably thinking, how are you supposed to understand that? We can study orbitals, and you will in chemistry, or you could do a little cheating. But by cheating, what I mean is we're just going to memorize something. Most science students are pretty good at memorizing. That's not the only thing you need to be able to be good at when you're taking a class like this, but you do still need to memorize a few things. This is one of the things that could help if you haven't taken much chemistry yet. To take a shortcut by memorizing a rule, I just call this biochemistry for beginners. First, you're going to need to remember the acronym SPONGE. If you've ever had these marshmallow cookies, that might help you remember it. I don't like them. They're too sweet. But nevertheless, there must be enough folks out there that do like them because I still see them in markets. SPONGE. SPONGE stands for the different elements that are important to life. Sulfur is the S, phosphorus is the P, O, oxygen, N for nitrogen, C for carbon, and H for hydrogen. So SPONGE. The chemical signals for these elements are just the letter. Next is the memorization part. You have to remember sort of a pin number that goes along with SPONGE. The pin number corresponds to the number of covalent bonds, the pairs of electrons that the element needs in order to be fulfilled or happy. So as I was mentioning, if you remember, hydrogen only needs its 1. How are we going to remember these? Just memorize them, okay? Sulfur needs 2, phosphorus needs 5, oxygen needs 2, nitrogen needs 3, carbon needs 4, hydrogen needs 1. If you look back at the periodic table, the position in the columns mostly predicts how many bonds that particular element will make. The only one here that's going to fall outside that rule is phosphorus. Phosphorus makes hybrid orbitals. We're not going to talk about that. Save that for chemistry. Just remember this pin number if you're not very good with chemistry yet, and you need to remember how many covalent bonds that particular element needs in order to fill the covalent bond rules to form valid molecules. Molecules like these that we just looked at, if we can remember that carbon needs 4 and hydrogen needs 1, you would have been able to predict very nicely that the only way we could have made the combination of 1 carbon, 2 hydrogens, and an oxygen work is that formaldehyde. This is what the value of SPONGE is. If you remember how many covalent bonds an element needs to fill that outermost electron shell, you can predict simple molecules. Now that we've talked about covalent bonds, we're going to talk about 2 different variations of covalent bonds. Nonpolar versus polar covalent bonds. What does that mean? Well, nonpolar essentially means equal sharing of electrons. If you look at this little picture that some students drew on a board, if 2 atoms are sharing a pair of electrons equally, they're equal partners in it, then this is nonpolar covalent bond. The electrons are spending as much time on one side of the molecule as they are on the other. If we're talking about 2 identical atoms, of course it's going to be nonpolar. They're the same type of atom. So one atom is not going to be exerting any kind of influence that's greater or less than on the electron pair than the other, because they're the same. If you think about hydrogen gas or oxygen gas when we're talking about the same 2 atoms, they form non-polar covalent bonds. There are no poles. The atoms have the same electronegativity if they're the same atom. Like identical twins, they have the same pole on the electron pair. When we're talking about compounds, we have atoms that are not the same. Importantly, molecules that have carbons and hydrogens either in a particular region of a molecule or the entire molecule. That region of, or that entire molecule, will be nonpolar. The bonds between carbons and hydrogens are not polar. Nonpolar covalent bonds exist between carbons and hydrogens. This is important to remember. When we talk about biomolecules, this feature is important. You can contrast that with the polar covalent bonds. Polar covalent bonds means there's unequal sharing of electrons because there's going to be different electronegativities between the atoms in the molecule. The classic example, the most important example for life, is the water molecule. If you look at these two different depictions of the water molecule, they're showing the same thing. They're showing that the larger oxygen atom is far more electronegative than the hydrogen atom. It pulls the electrons towards it. So the electrons that are being shared between the oxygen and the hydrogen spend far more time on the oxygen end of the molecule than they do on the hydrogen end of the molecule. What ends up happening then is that the oxygen end of the molecule has a partial negative charge. It's not a full-on charge as if it took an extra electron, but it's a partial negative charge because the electrons are spending more time over here. The hydrogens, with their one small little proton, are left without the electrons much of the time. So they end up having somewhat of a positive charge to them. The molecules have what's called poles. The poles are the charged ends of the molecules. The oxygen end, that pole is negative. The hydrogen ends, those are positive. The polar covalent bond causes poles that are going to allow for hydrogen bonding to happen. Remember, hydrogen bonding is separate from the polar covalent bond. Hydrogen bonds require that a molecule has a polar covalent bond, but they're not the same thing. We'll get back to this. We haven't talked about hydrogen bonds yet. We're still on covalent bonding. We'll circle back to hydrogen bonds shortly. Before we do that, we need to talk about another type of bond, the ionic bond. Ionic bonds occur when there's two atoms that have really different electronegativities. We're going to have an atom that ends up with a positive charge. The term for that is a cation. Or we're going to have an atom with a negative charge, and that's an anion. We have to have these oppositely charged atoms to have an ionic bond form. These opposite charges, the cations and the anions, are attracted to each other. Opposites attract. They form ionic bonds. There is no sharing of the electron. One is actually handing off an electron to the other is taking it, and then those oppositely charged atoms or molecules are attracted to each other and they come together. They typically form crystal structures known as salts. Table salt is formed from ionic bonds between sodium and chlorine ions. If you look at this figure from your textbook, it's actually depicting sodium, which is a metal. It's a solid here. It's actually quite reactive. We also have chlorine gas, which is known as mustard gas. Very reactive. Both of these things on their own are very dangerous, but when you add them together, they become sodium chloride, which is table salt. Pretty innocuous compared to the other two elements in their pure form. So let's take a look at forming an ionic bond. If we look here, we have a sodium atom. And if you look at the outer orbital, we have our lone electrons. So that sodium doesn't really want that electron because it would be much happier to have the next level full. If it just gave up that one, then its next shell is full. But by giving up the one, it's going to take on a positive charge. Because in this balanced form, the sodium has equal number of protons in the nucleus compared to the orbiting electrons. There's no overall charge. But if it gives up the electron, now it has more protons than electrons, so it has a positive charge. This is a sodium ion, and it's a cation with a positive charge. On the opposite spectrum, actually on the opposite side of the periodic table, is chlorine. As we were mentioning earlier, it has 7 electrons in its outer orbital, so it really wants one more electron to fill up that outer valence orbital. This electron that sodium is willing to give up will be greedily accepted by chlorine. Now chlorine will be happy because it has a full outer shell. But opposite to sodium, the chlorine now has one extra electron compared to the protons in its nucleus. So it will now have an overall negative charge because it has an extra electron compared to the protons. Now we have an anion. The chlorine ion is negatively charged. The sodium ion is positively charged. These opposite charges attract and they form an ionic bond. This is the basis of an ionic bond, the attraction of cations and anions to each other. Here we have a little chemistry joke. In the classroom depicted, there's some negatively charged individuals looking very attractive outside the window, and we have some positively charged individuals from inside the classroom that are being drawn towards the window. The instructor is asking the class, what is outside the window that is so attractive? Yeah, I know, corny chemistry joke depicting ionic bonds. Just trying to put a little bit of humor here into a challenging topic. Moving on now. We are faced with the crystal structure of salt. We can see that when a salt forms, when these ionic crystals form, we have these interspersed negative and positive atoms that arrange themselves in the crystalline structure. If you were to place them in water, they readily dissolve. You've experienced that, no doubt. One of the reasons that salts dissolve is because water is a great solvent, and we're going to look at that ability now, also in the future slide. If you look here, what's happening, when you take an ion, either positive or negative, the water molecules will orient themselves in such a way that the opposite charged pole, the pole that is charged oppositely to the ion, is going to arrange itself around the ion. In the case of sodium, which is positive, you can see that the negative end, the oxygen end of the water molecule, points towards the sodium. The negatively, or the partially negative polar end, the oxygen end, is oriented to the positive sodium. The arrangement helps keep the sodium ions in solution and the chloride ions. You can look at the opposite happening over here on the other side. When you look at the negative chlorine atom has all of the hydrogen ends of the water. Remember, the hydrogen ends are the positive poles of the water molecule. All of those hydrogen ends of water are oriented to the negatively charged chlorine. This is one of the reasons why water is a great solvent. It keeps everything suspended very well because of the ability to orient itself around the different dissolved substances and keep the substance suspended by having those opposite charges oriented towards each other. My hope is that you can remember what this looks like to explain this property of water. Practice drawing it out and explaining it so that if I were to ask you a question about it in the future, you can do a good job. All right, next let's look at the hydrogen bonds. We've talked about covalent bonds, and we've talked about the nonpolar and the polar covalent bonds, and we talked about ionic bonds. In terms of the strength of bonding, we've talked about that in the order of strength. Covalent bonds are the strongest, and we can go up to a triple covalent bond, which is really strong. So a triple covalent bond is the strongest, then double covalent bonds, and then single covalent bonds. Finally, we have ionic bonds, which are less strong than covalent bonds, especially if we are considering an aqueous environment, which is where life exists. The least strong of the bonds is the hydrogen bond. Hydrogen bonds are weak bonds, and they are only found when polar covalent bonds form molecules with polar ends. If you look here, we have our classic water molecule. The oxygen end is negative, the hydrogen end being positive. Below that, we can see what an ammonium molecule with a nitrogen and 3 hydrogens. It's also polar in the same or similar manner as the water molecule. You can tell by looking at the orientation between these two molecules that the positive end of one polar molecule is attracted to the negative end of another polar molecule. Opposite charges attract. With polar molecules, the same principle we observed in ionic bonds holds true. Opposite charges attract each other. When we have a polar molecule that has these polar ends, these positive and negative ends will orient themselves so that the positives and the negatives face each other and are attracted to each other. Convention tells us to indicate that a hydrogen bond has occurred between these two polar molecules with dotted lines. It's showing you that there's a hydrogen bond. This down here perhaps looks somewhat familiar. It's showing you the nitrogenous bases in DNA. On this side, we have cytosine or the C base, and over here, we have the guanine or the G base. The red dots between the different areas of the molecule are depicting hydrogen bonds. I bet you probably already knew that DNA, the two strands, are held together by hydrogen bonds. You may have heard that, but did not really know what that meant. Hopefully it's more clear now. We will revisit DNA and hydrogen bonds later. It's time right now to give yourself a little quiz. Without looking at your notes, see if you can, right now, jot down a description of the different types of bonds we just talked about. Pause this video until you're done, then restart it. Quickly write yourself a definition of nonpolar covalent, polar covalent, ionic, and hydrogen bonds as shown in this table. Pause the video now to complete it. Hopefully you actually did what I suggested. This is a learning tool. When you stop and try to establish a recall pathway for information, I'm about to go through the definitions, so if you didn't actually try it, you can still pause and restart to review and get the benefit of trying to firm up your recall pathway. Non-polar covalent bond. Did you say that there was equal sharing of the electrons between the two atoms? Because that's what's happening. It is a strong bond. A polar covalent bond. Unequal sharing of electrons between two atoms, such as what's happening with water. That's also a strong bond. Ionic bonds occur when you have an electron given up by one atom and taken by another, giving you actual charges called ions, both positive cations and negative anions, and then oppositely charged atoms attract to form a molecule. That's a weak bond, especially in water. The ionic bond will quickly dissociate in water. Hydrogen bonds require molecules with polar covalent bonds. They will happen between molecules, such as between two water molecules, or between the opposite regions of the same large molecule. Imagine something such as a long RNA strand. This molecule will have poles and can fold on itself to create hydrogen bonds between different regions of that large molecule. Hopefully you have that down. Test yourself again later and see if you're able to recall the types and differences between the bonds. I think this is a good place to pause. We'll pick up on part 3 with the next video.